The morning Seraphina Voss walked into the glass tower of Mercer Acquisitions. She had exactly $47 in her bank account, a résumé she had rewritten 11 times the night before, and a quiet, burning desperation she had learned to hide behind perfectly pressed clothes and a steady gaze. She was not supposed to be there. The position had been filled, according to the automated email shed received 3 weeks prior. But a woman who had survived what Seraphina had survived did not take automated emails as final answers. She had shown up anyway, sat in the lobby for 6 hours, and somehow, through sheer immovable presence, landed herself a last-minute interview with the assistant to the assistant of the chief operating officer. It was the smallest door she could have walked through, but she walked through it. She got the job. A junior acquisitions analyst entry level, barely above administrative, the kind of role that people with her credentials would have laughed at 5 years ago. But 5 years ago, Seraphina had a life that looked nothing like this. 5 years ago, she had a fiancé, a corner.
This is Wake Up Files, where ordinary moments turn into unforgettable stories of kindness and love. If this story speaks to your heart, make sure to like the video, share it with someone who needs inspiration, comment below, and subscribe to Wake Up Files for more powerful stories.
Her office at a mid-sized investment firm in Boston, a future that felt designed and certain. Then the fraud case broke. Not her fraud, she had never touched a single unauthorized number, but her name was on the team. Her signature was on documents she had trusted her then fiancé to prepare correctly. And when the investigators came, it was her career they dismantled first because she had no one powerful enough to protect her. He walked away with a lesser charge and a settlement. She walked away with nothing but her name, which had been dragged through enough financial news outlets that it left a stain she could not scrub clean, no matter how many interviews she sat through, no matter how many references she collected, no matter how many times she explained, with carefully measured calm, that she had been deceived. Mercer Acquisitions had not done a deep enough background check on her name. Or perhaps they had and simply didn't care about a 3-year-old scandal in Boston when they were based in Chicago. Either way, Seraphina was not going to question it. She showed up on her first day 40 minutes early, learned every system they threw at her within the first week, stayed past midnight on projects that weren't even assigned to her, and made herself quietly indispensable in the way that only people with something to prove ever truly can. She had been working there for 4 months before she saw him. Nathaniel Mercer did not look like the kind of man who built empires. He looked like the kind of man who had inherited one, and then, inexplicably, made it larger through sheer will and an unsettling intelligence that seemed to operate several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. He was 38, had the kind of focus in his eyes that made people either stand straighter or look away entirely, and he moved through the floors of his building as if the air itself adjusted to accommodate him. Seraphina had heard the stories, the way everyone at Mercer heard the stories, that he had taken the company from a struggling mid-level firm to one of the most aggressive acquisition powerhouses in the Midwest in under a decade, that he had fired a VP on a Tuesday for submitting a report with a single incorrect decimal point, not because of the error itself, but because the man had tried to hide it, that he hadn't taken a personal day in 3 years, that he had ended his engagement to the daughter of a senator 2 years ago without explanation, and that no one who worked for him had ever dared ask why. Seraphina had no intention of having any interaction with Nathaniel Mercer. She was 3 floors below his level of existence, and she intended to stay there, do her work, rebuild her reputation quietly, and eventually use Mercer as a stepping stone back to the kind of career she had lost. That was the plan. It was a clean, logical plan, and it lasted exactly until the afternoon he walked into the small conference room on the 14th floor, where she had been working alone for 3 hours on a restructuring analysis no one had asked her to do, but that she had noticed was urgently needed when she had been cross-referencing files for her actual assignment. He had come to use the room for a call. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up, recognized him immediately, and felt the very specific kind of dread that comes from being caught doing something that looks either impressive or insane, depending on the perspective of the person watching. She explained, briefly, and without apology, what she was doing and why. He said nothing for a long moment, looked at the documents spread across the table, looked at her, and then asked her one question about her methodology. She answered. He asked another. She answered that too. He left without another word, made his call from somewhere else. And Seraphina sat alone in the conference room for a full minute afterward, trying to decide if she had just made a terrible mistake. 2 days later, she was reassigned to a direct reporting position under Marcus Tell, Nathaniel's most senior analyst. It was a significant jump, the kind of jump that didn't happen by accident. Working closer to Nathaniel Mercer was not the same as working with him. He was not warm. He was not the type of man who learned the names of the people 3 rungs below him on a corporate ladder, unless they had somehow made it necessary for him to know their names. He communicated through Marcus, through briefs, through margin notes on documents that came back covered in precise, sometimes cutting observations written in a handwriting that was surprisingly careful for someone who appeared to do everything at full speed. Seraphina adapted to him the way she had adapted to every difficult environment in her life, by paying attention, by learning the patterns, by making herself so competent that her presence became something that worked in his favor without ever requiring him to acknowledge it directly. But then came the Delvara deal. It was the largest acquisition Mercer had pursued in 4 years, a tech-adjacent logistics company with complicated debt structures, and a board that was fighting internally over whether to sell at all. Nathaniel had been working toward it for 8 months. The night before the final negotiation meeting, something went wrong with the financial model, a corrupted file, a cascading error through 3 linked spreadsheets that no one caught until 11 at night, when the presentation was due to be finalized by 7 the next morning. Marcus was on a flight back from a family emergency. 2 other senior analysts looked at the damage and quietly went pale. Seraphina stayed. She did not volunteer dramatically or make a speech. She simply pulled her chair closer to the screen, asked someone to order coffee for the room, and began working. Nathaniel found her at 2 in the morning, still at her desk, 3 empty coffee cups beside her, the corrected model rebuilt from scratch and already running verification checks. He stood in the doorway of the open office floor for a moment before he spoke. He told her to go home and get a few hours of sleep. She told him the model still needed 2 more verification passes, and she would sleep when they were clean. He pulled a chair from the nearest empty desk, sat down across from her, and for the next 2 hours they worked in near silence, side by side, checking figures and stress testing assumptions, until the model was clean and the presentation was ready, and the city outside the windows had just begun to show the first gray light of dawn. He looked at her then, across the scattered papers and the cold remains of corporate coffee, and said something she did not expect. He said she was wasted in the position she was in. She told him she was aware of that. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost a slight shift in the hard lines of his face that she suspected most people never got to see. They went home separately to sleep for 3 hours, and the Delvara deal closed the following afternoon at a number that exceeded projections by 12%. After that, things changed in ways that were professional, and then, quietly, and without either of them making a decision about it, in ways that were something else entirely. It happened in increments, the way significant things between 2 guarded people always do. A conversation after a late meeting that stretched longer than it needed to. The way he began to ask her opinion directly, not through Marcus, not through briefs, but in the moment, face to face, with the kind of attention that made her feel seen in a way she had not felt in years. The way she learned that beneath the precision and the controlled distance he wore like a second suit, there was a person who had also been betrayed, not in the same way, not with the same public consequences, but deeply enough that he had decided the safest architecture for his life was one that did not require trusting anyone fully. His engagement had ended because his fiancée had been feeding information about the company to a competitor. A person he had loved, or tried to love, had used him as a resource, and he had found out in the worst possible way. And he had dealt with it the only way he knew how, by pulling every wall up higher and deciding that the professional world was the only world he would allow himself to inhabit completely. Seraphina understood this in her bones. And that understanding, that specific, unspoken recognition of 2 people who had both learned that trusting the wrong person could cost you everything, was the thing that made the space between them feel different from any space she had occupied with anyone else. It was not easy. It was not soft or simple. It was 2 very damaged, very capable people standing close to something that frightened them both, and neither of them fully naming it. There was an evening in late October when they stayed late reviewing a report that had already been reviewed, and both of them knew it. And when the building had emptied and the city lights were spread out below the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office like a second sky, he told her about the night he found out about his fiancée. He told it plainly, without asking for sympathy, in the same tone he used to discuss quarterly performance. And she recognized that tone because it was exactly the tone she used when she talked about what had happened in Boston. The tone of someone who has processed something so many times that they have learned to carry it without the weight showing. She told him her story then, all of it. Not the careful edited version she kept ready for interviews and professional conversations, but the real version, the one that included how she had cried alone in her car outside the courthouse, because she had nowhere to go, and no one to call, the one that included the 8 months of applications and rejections, and the slow, grinding humiliation of watching everything she had built dissolve. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the room was very quiet, and when he finally spoke, he said that whoever had left her to take the fall alone was the worst kind of coward, and that she had done something remarkable by not becoming someone who punished the world for it. She looked at him for a long moment after he said that, and something shifted in the room, or perhaps in her chest, and she thought that she might be in serious trouble. She was right. The weeks that followed were a careful, almost unbearable negotiation between what was happening and what either of them was willing to admit was happening. He was her employer, in the technical sense that mattered. She was aware, every moment, of the power differential and what it could mean for everything she had worked to rebuild. She had not come this far and fought this hard to become a story about a woman who complicated her professional recovery with something personal. She kept her boundaries. She kept her focus. She told herself, with the same discipline she had applied to every other part of her reconstruction, that this was not a path she was going to walk down. And then came the night of the Caldwell Charity Gala, which Mercer attended as a presenting sponsor, and to which several senior staff were invited, and at which Seraphina found herself standing on a rooftop terrace in a midnight blue dress she had saved 2 paychecks to buy, looking out at the Chicago skyline and feeling, for the first time in a very long time, like herself, not the version of herself that was surviving, but the version that had once believed the world had beautiful things in. It meant for her too. Nathaniel found her there. He stood beside her and they talked for a long time about nothing that mattered and everything that did. And at some point, the conversation became something quieter and closer than a conversation between a CEO and a junior analyst had any business being. And when he turned to look at her, the walls she had learned to read on his face were simply gone. He looked like a man standing on the edge of something he had told himself he would never approach again. She knew, because she looked the same way, because she felt the same way, because she was standing on that exact same edge, and the drop below was everything she had spent 3 years rebuilding. He said her name once, quietly, and then he said something she would replay in her mind for the rest of that long, impossible week. He said she should leave before he changed his mind, not coldly, not as a dismissal. He said it the way a person says something when they are trying to protect someone else from a risk they think they represent, when they believe that wanting something makes them dangerous to it. He said it like a man who had learned that the people he let close eventually paid a price, and who had decided a long time ago that protecting others from himself was the most honest form of care he had left to offer. She did not leave. She stood there and looked at him and told him that she had spent 3 years letting other people's fears and failures make her decisions for her, and she was finished with that. She told him that she was not afraid of him, not because she was reckless, but because she had learned, the hardest possible way, to tell the difference between something that was genuinely dangerous and something that only felt dangerous because it mattered. She told him that if he wanted her to leave, he would have to mean it, because she was done leaving rooms she had every right to stand in. The silence afterward was the longest of her life. And then Nathaniel Mercer, who had not let anyone past his architecture of control and professional distance in 2 years, who had decided that the safest life was a solitary one, reached out and took her hand in the dark of that rooftop terrace, with the whole lit city behind them, and held it like something he intended to keep. What followed was not easy or cinematic in the way of movies. It was complicated and careful and full of conversations that other couples might have skipped, conversations about professional boundaries and optics, and what they each needed in order to feel safe. He moved her role to a sister company within the Mercer Group, where she reported to an independent board, not to him, so there could never be a question about what her work owed to anything other than her own ability. She appreciated this not because it was romantic, but because it was the kind of thoughtful structural respect that she had almost forgotten to expect. He learned to let someone in again the way people relearn things that fear has almost erased slowly, and sometimes stopping, and sometimes having to be gently reminded that closeness was not the same as vulnerability in the dangerous sense. She learned that love the second time around, when you have both been broken by the first version, is quieter and more deliberate and more honest than anything she had imagined when she was 28 and certain she had the future mapped. It does not announce itself. It arrives the way dawn arrived that morning after the Delvara all-nighter, slowly, undeniably, changing the quality of everything it touches. There were people who had opinions about them. There were whispers in the industry that Seraphina Voss had found a convenient ladder to climb. She had expected this, and it hurt exactly as much as she had steeled herself for it to hurt, and then she went back to her work and let the work speak with the same quiet, relentless voice it had always spoken in. Within a year, she had led 2 major acquisitions for the sister company independently. Within 18 months, she was headlining industry profiles that mentioned her history in Boston and framed it as the origin story of one of the sharpest financial minds currently operating in the Midwest market. The stain did not disappear, it became context, and context, she had learned, is just pain that has finally been given a frame. As for the man who had told her to leave before he changed his mind, he had changed his mind in the most complete and irreversible way. He was still precise and demanding and occasionally terrifying in a boardroom. He was still the person who sent documents back with handwritten margin notes that could make a senior analyst rethink their career choices. But he was also the person who left her a coffee on her desk on the morning she came in early, without a note, because neither of them were people who needed notes for the things that were simply true. He was the person who, one evening almost 2 years after that rooftop terrace, told her that he had spent the better part of his adult life building things, and that she was the first thing he had ever built toward rather than built around, and that the difference had changed something in him he didn't have language for yet, but intended to spend a long time learning to name. Seraphina Voss, who had $47 in her account the morning she walked into a glass tower and refused to be turned away, who had carried the weight of someone else's crime like a stone around her neck for 3 years, who had rebuilt herself with nothing but discipline and defiance and a faith in her own ability that no verdict, no dismissal, no automated email could fully extinguish. She sat with that and felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of. She felt like she had arrived, not at a destination, not at the perfectly designed future she had once imagined, but at herself, the truest version. She's the one who's got the real deal. The one forged in the years when everything that had been given to her was taken away, and only what was genuinely hers remained. She had arrived at a life that was entirely, undeniably her own, and it had begun on the morning she decided that $47 and a door that said closed were not, in fact, the same thing. If this story moved something in you, if it reminded you that the hardest chapters are sometimes the ones that lead you to the life you actually deserved, then this video was made for you. Please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear that starting over is not the same as losing, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Before we close, drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever been told to walk away from something that turned out to be exactly where you were meant to stay? Your story matters, and someone reading the comments tonight needs to know they're not alone. Some people leave when they're told to, and some people stand still, look the fear in the eye, and choose themselves anyway. Seraphina chose herself, and that made all the difference.